Two peoples, one land. Over a century of conflict that has shaped the modern Middle East and divided the world. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most complex and enduring disputes in human history, with roots that stretch back thousands of years. From ancient kingdoms to modern nations, from promises made in smoke-filled rooms to wars fought in the streets, this is the complete story of how we got here. What really started this conflict? How did two peoples come to claim the same homeland? Today we explore the entire history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What if we told you this conflict began not in 1948, but over 3,000 years ago when the first kingdoms rose from this contested soil? The land between the Mediterranean Sea and Jordan River has witnessed more claims of ownership than perhaps any other territory on Earth. Each civilization that settled here left behind not just ruins and artifacts, but stories about why this land belonged to them. The ancient Hebrews established kingdoms here around 1000 BCE, with King David making Jerusalem his capital, and King Solomon building the first temple. Biblical accounts describe Abraham receiving divine promises about this territory, creating a foundation story that would echo through millennia. But the Hebrews were not alone. Canaanite tribes had already been farming these hills and valleys for centuries before the Israelites arrived. The Philistines controlled the coastal areas, giving their name to the region the Romans would later call Palestine. Archaeological evidence tells a complex story of continuous settlement by various Semitic peoples throughout this period. Many of these ancient inhabitants would eventually become part of what we now recognize as Arab identity. Their descendants lived through successive conquerors and rulers, maintaining their connection to the land through farming, trade, and local customs that passed from generation to generation. The Roman Empire changed everything in 70 CE when they destroyed the Second Temple and scattered Jewish populations across their vast territories. This event, known as the diaspora, sent Jews to communities throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Yet despite this forced exile, Jewish communities never forgot their connection to this homeland. They prayed facing Jerusalem, celebrated holidays tied to the agricultural seasons of their ancestral land, and maintained the hope of return for nearly 2,000 years. Meanwhile, Arab tribes moved into the region during the early Islamic conquests of the 7th century. They built mosques, established trade routes, and created their own deep cultural ties to the same territory. The Dome of the Rock rose on the Temple Mount, marking the spot where Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. Jerusalem became the third holiest city in Islam. The Crusades brought yet another layer of claims when European Christians fought to control what they called the Holy Land. For 2 centuries, Crusader kingdoms ruled parts of the region, adding Christian narratives of divine right to an already crowded field of competing stories. Each group developed powerful narratives about their ancestral connection to this small piece of earth. These stories became more than history. They became identity. Jewish communities in exile maintained detailed memories of their homeland through religious texts and traditions. Arab families passed down oral histories of their villages and olive groves. Both peoples created founding myths that justified their presence and their rights. These ancient claims became the foundation for modern nationalism. When Jewish Zionism emerged in the late 1800s, it could point to centuries of biblical and historical connection. When Arab-Palestinian identity formed in response, it too drew on generations of continuous presence and cultural attachment. But it was the collapse of an empire in the early 1900s that would transform these ancient tensions into a modern crisis. How did a single letter written by a British Foreign Secretary in 1917 help ignite a conflict that rages to this day? When the Ottoman Empire crumbled after World War I, Britain found itself controlling Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. The British faced pressure from multiple directions about what should happen to this strategic territory that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. The problem was that Britain had already made contradictory promises to different groups during the war. Through the Hussein McMahon correspondence in 1915, British officials had encouraged Arab revolt against the Ottomans by promising to support Arab independence in former Ottoman territories. But in November 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Lord Rothschild declaring that Britain viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This became known as the Balfour Declaration. Jewish immigration to Palestine started slowly in the 1920s. About 84,000 Jews lived there when the British Mandate began. But the numbers exploded in the 1930s as Nazi persecution in Germany and Eastern Europe drove desperate families to seek refuge anywhere they could find it. By the end of World War II, over 600,000 Jews had settled in Palestine. This massive demographic shift happened in just 2 decades. Palestinian Arabs watched their clear majority shrink as newcomers arrived with money to buy land from absentee Ottoman landlords. Jewish settlers established separate communities with their own schools, hospitals, and economic systems. This created competition for jobs and resources that British colonial administrators struggled to manage. The two communities lived increasingly separate lives. Violence broke out repeatedly during this period. The 1929 riots saw Arab attacks on Jewish communities in Hebron and Safed. The Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939 included strikes, boycotts, and armed resistance against British rule and Jewish immigration. Jewish militant groups like the Irgun and Lehi responded by targeting British forces and Arab civilians. Britain tried to calm the situation through the White Paper of 1939, which limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 over 5 years. But Holocaust survivors continued arriving illegally on ships that British forces often intercepted. Arab leaders rejected any compromise that would allow Jewish statehood in any part of Palestine. The discovery of Nazi death camps after World War II created enormous international sympathy for Jewish survivors who had nowhere else to go. But Palestinian Arabs felt they were being forced to pay for European crimes they had no part in committing. They saw their homeland being given away to compensate for someone else's genocide. By 1947, Britain gave up trying to solve this impossible puzzle. They handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations, which proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. The Arabs rejected partition completely. The Jews accepted it reluctantly, knowing it was less than they wanted, but more than they might get otherwise. Both sides prepared for the war that would reshape the Middle East forever. What happened in 1948 created a refugee crisis that still defines this conflict more than 75 years later. But the full story is more complex than either side admits. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War began on May 15th, the day after David Ben-Gurion declared Israeli independence in Tel Aviv. 5 Arab armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq attacked the new Jewish state while Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes across the territory. Israel won this war decisively, expanding far beyond the borders the UN partition plan had proposed. The new state controlled 78% of historic Palestine, instead of the 55% the UN had allocated. But victory came with consequences that still shape the region today. Around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees during this conflict. Some fled the fighting voluntarily, others were forced out by Israeli military operations. Both sides developed competing stories about what really happened and who was responsible. The Six-Day War of 1967 changed the situation completely when Israel captured the West Bank from Jordan, the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and East Jerusalem. This military victory brought over 1 million Palestinians under Israeli occupation. Israel now controlled all of historic Palestine, but it also faced the challenge of governing a hostile population that wanted independence. Peace attempts repeatedly failed to solve the core issues. The Camp David Accords of 1978 made peace between Israel and Egypt but completely ignored Palestinian concerns. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s created real hope when Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn. But the peace process collapsed amid renewed violence and broken promises from both sides. The Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005 brought suicide bombings to Israeli cities, while Israeli military operations devastated Palestinian communities. This violence destroyed much of the trust that had been built during the peace process. Israel responded by building a security barrier that reduced attacks but also separated Palestinian families and restricted their movement. Settlement expansion in the West Bank continued despite international criticism. Gaza became a separate problem after Israel withdrew all settlers and soldiers in 2005. Hamas took control of the territory and launched rockets into Israel, leading to repeated wars. The West Bank remained under Palestinian Authority governance but with limited autonomy under Israeli military occupation. External powers made everything more complicated. The United States provided billions in military aid to Israel, while Iran backed militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Arab states often pursued their own regional interests rather than focusing on Palestinian welfare. Today, over 5 million Palestinian refugees and their descendants live in camps across Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. Israelis and Palestinians remain locked in cycles of violence and failed negotiations. The two-state solution that once seemed inevitable now appears nearly impossible, leaving both peoples trapped in a conflict that has defined their identities for generations. This conflict has survived the Cold War, the Arab Spring, and countless peace initiatives because it represents something deeper than politics. It's about two peoples who both call the same land home. Each side has genuine historical connections and real grievances that cannot be easily dismissed or forgotten. The next chapter of this story remains unwritten, and it may well depend on whether future generations can find a way to honor both people's deep connections to this ancient land. What do you think it will take to finally bring peace to this region? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more deep dives into the conflicts that shape our world.